Good morning. Welcome. It's Sunday morning, and we are into the last couple of days of the life of Jesus in Luke 22 as we move from the plot, which we looked at yesterday, made by Judas Iscariot with the chief priests and scribes to betray Jesus, into the Last Supper, the institution of the Last Supper, the communion, what's called the communion. Very simple ceremony. It's interesting as we come into this part to reflect again that the largest, by far the largest portion of the Gospels is given to the record of the Last Supper, the betrayal, the trial, and the death of Jesus. Huge amount. Indeed, the last week of the life of Jesus is the biggest portion of any of the Gospels. Of course, in John's Gospel, at the Last Supper, Jesus gives a very long discourse about the Holy Spirit and about the future for his disciples. And the one thing that John does not include is the institution of the Lord's Supper, the sharing of the bread and wine in remembrance of Jesus. That is recorded in the other three Gospels and repeated by Paul in 1 Corinthians 11, which we often quote. It's the longest passage about the bread and wine. We often quote that when we celebrate communion. When it's prepared in verses 7 to 13, we get the impression here that there were ways that Jesus and his disciples planned things, especially when they were in Jerusalem, that hid where they were going to be from those who were trying to get him, because the plots were going to be about after dark, because to arrest him in the daytime, he was surrounded by people every day, and to arrest him in front of a crowd would have been very difficult. So they were plotting how they excuse me, could arrest him when it was dark. And of course the Last Supper, it was the Passover meal was in the evening, and they prepare it in an upper room, or a guest room, a large upper room, and they're told who to approach. A man carrying a jar of water. That's an interesting sign, really, because when you read the Old Testament and so on, it was the women who collected the water from the well. It was not the men. So it would be very rare to see a man carrying a jar of water. And this was obviously a sign to the disciples that this was the man that Jesus had asked if he could use that man's large upper room. An arrangement made to keep this meal secret from not only from the scribes and Pharisees, but also from the crowds, because it was a private meal with Jesus and the disciples. So Judas was at the meal, and we have various bits in the different Gospels about the exchange between Jesus and Judas at the Last Supper. But it's so well known. What can one say about it? But that it is the most central. It is a ritual, but it's not a ritual in another way. It's a very simple thing that Jesus did. He simply took something that was on the table, and he used it. He used it to symbolize his death and resurrection, his giving of himself, giving of his body, and the use that his blood was going to be put to save the world, and to seal the covenant made that he was making between God and everyone else and all of mankind. He was going to be the personal lamb of sacrifice that would seal the covenant with its blood, the perfect lamb. Interestingly, because the Passover meal was a meal full of symbolism. Everything that was cooked and eaten at the Passover meal symbolized part of the great deliverance that God made of Israel out of Egypt back long in the days of Moses. That deliverance was symbolized by so many things that were on the table. People have studied that, and it's worth a study. And so it's very interesting that the first great deliverance of God from Egypt, from the bondage of Egypt, the slavery, the hardship, the dead-end life that the people of Israel had in Egypt, where they were owned and mastered by the Egyptians, and God miraculously set them free. Every single one of them was freed, and the freedom was attained with the death of a lamb whose blood was daubed on the doorposts, and all who stayed within the house were saved. And it's interesting that Jesus sent Judas out of the room before he shared the body and blood with his disciples, the bread and the wine, because Judas was going to be outside that room that held salvation. Everything was symbolic, and it just says wonderful things to me about the fact that God understands our human nature. After all, he made us. He understands us so well that we, in all our lives, we have things that remind us of other things to help us remember and keep a memory fresh. I don't know if you have things. I'm sure you do. You have lots of things around your house. I'm looking at one thing. I've got two things up on my shelf here. I picked this up. It's a fish. It doesn't mean anything to you apart from the fact that it's a pretty little fish. But I look at this fish and I remember the lady who gave it to me. I remember the circumstances it was given to me in, and I see her face, and I remember what God did to bless her, and why she gave me this fish. She went out and found something that she could give me to say thank you. That's the fish. This other one is a goat, and I don't need to look at the label on it to remember which holiday Terry and I were on when we bought this goat as a souvenir and we brought it home. We use things in our lives to remember. All sorts of things remind us of things, and God knows that we need regular reminders to keep people and things and events fresh in our minds. And God gave us the simplest of reminders of the most profound thing that he ever did for this world when he sent Jesus to die for us. And I thank God every time I go to a communion or breaking of bread service of how wonderful salvation is, how great a cost, but how free the grace is that's given to us. And the reminder is ours every time we break bread together. And I thank God that Jesus placed that service within our reach, all of our reach. And it is very precious. So perhaps today we can just think on something about the communion that means so much to each of us. Have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.